realfaith.org.au.
When we joined the Hare Krishna movement, which I was in for about 7 years, there were some cardinal rules. One was no meat eating, because that would adversely affect your karma. Then there was no intoxication, no drinking drugs or anything. So those were good things, but they were very tough to follow in the summer of love. So we would get our spiritual input and then, we'd live our wild life.
Welcome to Real Faith. Conversations about the impact faith has on our lives and the challenges we go through, helping us today and giving us hope for tomorrow. That's real people, real life, and real faith with Eric Scatterbo.
Author and columnist Nils Haug was born in Norway and migrated to South Africa when he was 4 years old. He eventually went to university to become a lawyer and became heavily involved in the Hare Krishna movement. It was at this time that he attended a Bible study with the goal of telling Christians how wrong they were. But something unexpected happened. We'll find out about that and more as Nils shares his remarkable story. Nils Haug, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Eric. I'm going to enjoy being here and sharing the greatness of our God with your listeners.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And as we just heard, you were involved in the Hare Krishna movement. And for people who aren't familiar with that, what is that all about?
Well, it's an expression of Hinduism. It was started by a Swami, a holy man in India, and at a rather advanced age, in his 60s, he traveled to New York, and he started this movement, which in 11 years became a worldwide phenomena and one of the most public and visible expressions of Hinduism in the Western world. Eventually, some of the Beatles, I think John Lennon, but particularly George Harrison, became a devotee of the Hare Krishna movement. And I had the fortune, the privilege of, as a young man, of meeting the founder of the movement when he came to South Africa.
Okay, so we are going to get to that a little bit later in our conversation when we get to that part in your life. But I should say, of course, the Beatles and George Harrison were the most prominent followers that most people would remember this song going all the way back to, I think, the 70s, My Sweet Lord. And he wasn't talking about the Lord Jesus. That song, I think somewhere in there is saying Krishna, Krishna. Am I right?
Exactly right. It was almost a chant to Krishna, and in that form of Hinduism, as in all of them, they say their mantras on beads, and that was part of the mantra he was singing in that song.
Okay, so that's kind of interesting, but we'll get to that eventually. First off, let's find out where it all began for you. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in a town called Tonsberg in Norway, and that is the oldest town in Norway. And my mother was from the West Coast, and my father was from Oslo, and they met in Oslo.
Now, when you're 4 years old, you migrated to South Africa?
That's right. As with most people in Scandinavia and some European countries in those days, the state religion was Lutheranism, and my parents were Lutherans, although, as was normal in those days, people were quite reticent about expressing their faith, but they all had Bibles and they read their Bibles, and to this day I have Bibles from my mother and my grandfather, and I think even older. I have a collection of Bibles from my family, so obviously there were believers amongst them.
Oh, okay, so that's part of your heritage, but it really wasn't emphasized. Is that what you're saying?
That's correct.
Okay, so what was it like for you being 4 years old on a cargo ship, traveling to South Africa?
It was a lot of fun because my younger brother and I, we were the only kids on board, and it was a cargo ship, and we were the only passengers with my mother because my father had traveled ahead a few months earlier to South Africa to set up home and get organized and get a job and to prepare for our arrival. And we had a lot of fun. We were totally spoilt, and the crew and the captain just inundated us with candy and lollies, and we used to throw them through the porthole in the bow, the front of the ship, and then run to the end, to the stern, to see whose candy was winning the race.
So many candies that you didn't know what to do with them.
We used to throw them in the ocean.
Yeah.
You know, so it was a great time, and that's what I remember mostly.
Mm-hmm.
And when we arrived in Durban, my father came aboard to meet us. He hadn't seen us for a number of months, and I had no idea who he was. And I went up and I whispered in my mother's ear. I said, "Mom," in Norwegian, is this man going to sleep here tonight? and she said, "This is your father." And so that's how
wow.
I was reintroduced to my father. We hadn't seen him for so long. So that was great. And we arrived at great sunshine, and the climate in Durban is very much like Brisbane in Queensland, and it's a fantastic climate. So we had escaped the cold climate in Norway, which my mother particularly hated, and she loved the sunshine. So we had arrived at the right place.
But there were some challenges for you personally? Well, for your whole family?
Yeah, the challenges were that we were Norwegian speaking, and obviously the two official languages in South Africa at the time were English and Afrikaans, which is a form of Dutch. It's an indigenous language. We could speak neither of them, and so as young kids we didn't really have a problem because kids seem to communicate. But my mother went and took lessons in English, and my father could speak some, and he spoke many languages, my father, and so they kind of managed and they grew, but they both retained very strong accents all the days of their life.
Mm-hmm. And what year was this?
1956.
Okay, so that was when you arrived, and that was during apartheid years?
Yeah, it was an apartheid, and we knew nothing of that really, and it wasn't really noticeable because the African people they had their designated areas, and there was what is called the Group Areas Act, and the whites lived in certain suburbs, and the blacks in other suburbs, and the Indian people in other suburbs, and people of mixed race called the coloureds, which they call themselves coloureds. They also had their own designated area, and no one was really allowed to intermingle socially.
So it just became normal to you?
Yeah, it just became quite normal. There was very little crime, if any, and it was for white people. It was a great place, but obviously for black people, it was not a great place.
Yeah.
They were under heavy restrictions, curfews, limitation as to work opportunities, prejudice and bias and discrimination, and all that kind of stuff. And as I got older and started going to university, these things became more apparent to me.
Yeah, but as a kid, you didn't have any idea.
No idea.
Okay, and then when you were 11 years old, something significant happened?
Yeah, we had lived in Durban for about 7 years, and then there was a very strong Norwegian community in Durban, mainly because of the whaling industry. Some Norwegians about 30 years earlier had started a whaling company in Durban, and there was about 12 whalers, and it was run and owned by Scandinavians, Norwegians, and all these sort of managers and executives were all Scandinavians, and so it was a very vibrant community. And amongst them, my father was not in the whaling industry; he was a businessman, and he got together with his brother, who was already in Durban, working for the whaling company, in charge of the ships. He was a marine engineer, and so they decided to purchase a hotel in the mountains called the Drakensberg. You know, in those days it was about 4 or 5 hour drive. Nowadays it's 2 hours. And so when I was 11, we moved up into this rural area, spectacular rural area in the foot of mountains, to run and part own a 130-bed country hotel.
And what impact did all this have on you personally?
Well, first of all, the absolute freedom, being in nature, roaming around with, with people of various races, our age, and having a tremendous time. But the problem was the schooling, and the roads were all loose dirt in those days, and the school was about 35 kilometers away. So we traveled in on a Monday morning and we were fetched on a Friday afternoon. There was a boarding establishment for boys and girls separately, and we had to stay there during the week. The problem was that my brother and I were foreigners. We couldn't speak Afrikaans, could speak a bit of English by then. And so, we were criticized and picked on and attempts at bullying and that, especially by some of the Afrikaner kids who were really tough because they were farm kids. And some of them were really poor. I mean, they even in winter when it gets very cold there with frost everywhere and what have you, they'd walk barefoot.
Wow.
And, so things escalated to the extent that I was challenged to a fight when I was 11 years old. And the housemaster, he gave us boxing gloves, and this guy and I slogged it out and somehow won. And that sort of engendered respect from the others, and that the guy and I that fought, he was a really nice guy, as it turned out later, and we became good friends. And after that, things were very peaceful.
Yeah,
and,
so boxing gloves,
so-
that was a good idea, so you couldn't really hurt each other.
Oh, that's right. We're both 11 years old, and
Yeah.
but that was the kind of tough environment that these kids, farm kids, were brought up in. I mean, they were really tough, and some kids that lived, say, 10, 15 kilometers from the school used to come in on horseback every day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they used to ride into school on horseback, and so on dirt roads. So those were the days.
Yeah, and the horse just stands there the whole day.
Yeah, nearby were some cattle pens that they used to have cattle auctions in, so a groom would always come with them, and he would look after the horses until it was time to pick up the kids again and go home.
Our guest today is Nils Haug, who is originally from Norway, but migrated to South Africa when he was 4 years old. We'll find out how Nils eventually becomes involved in the Hairy Christian movement as he shares more of his story when we return right here on Real Faith.
The Word for Today is Australia's most widely read daily devotional, designed to give you practical teaching to keep you focused on your relationship with Jesus. Read it online or subscribe to the free printed edition at thewordfortoday.com.au.
You're listening to Real Faith, conversations with real people about how God works in their lives. If you want to know more about integrating faith into your life, our website is realfaith.org.au. Just go to the website and you'll find helpful articles about the impact faith can have on your life. Once again, that's realfaith.org.au.
Welcome back. I'm Eric Scadabo, and today I'm chatting with author and columnist Nils Haug, who was born in Norway and migrated to South Africa when he was 4 years old. Next, we're going to hear how he eventually becomes heavily involved in the Hairy Christian movement after he went to university to become a lawyer. Okay, so initially you were just away from home Monday through Friday. But then when you went to high school, it changed.
Yeah, that's in high school. When I went to high school, that was much further away, and I like to call it a reformatory, but of course that's an exaggeration. But it was a very tough and very strict government school, a good school in academically, I think. But the boarding establishment where most of the kids resided was extremely strict. If you did the slightest thing wrong, you'd get caned. And the food was terrible, the bullying, the fights. I got involved in a number of fights there to avoid my brother and I being bullied. So just to keep the status quo going. So
what were some of the things that you'd get caned for?
Well, if your towel wasn't straight at the end of your bed, you'd get caned. If you came 10 seconds or 5 seconds late for roll call, which they had twice a day, you'd get caned. If you were out of bounds, if you left the school without permission, you'd get caned. And depending on the severity of the offense, the number of cuts that you'd get on your backside with a cane would increase. And of course, this made most kids extremely rebellious. And so we used to get up to impossible things, go out at night when everyone was sleeping. I found a girlfriend that was a day scholar that lived 300 meters from the school gates, and I used to visit her frequently. And then there was a teacher who cottoned on to what I was doing in the afternoons instead of playing sport. And then he'd wait for me and he'd say, "Oh, see you tonight, Haug." And I'd say, "Yes, sir." And I'd go in and get my caning. But it was worth it, you know.
Huh. Well, it sounds like, first off, it sounds like some kind of a military academy, being so strict.
Yes, it had a militaristic element to it for the simple reason that there was a bush war going on the borders of South Africa and Rhodesia, as it was called then, it's now Zimbabwe. And we had to do, every Friday, we had to do a few hours of cadets where we'd dress up in our uniforms and we'd have parades and learn how to march, and some of the senior guys would learn how to shoot with .22 rifles at the rifle range right there in the school. So yes, we were really taught. There was levels of command. We'd have to stand on parade in the hot sun till the guys fainted. I never fainted, surprisingly enough, but some of my friends all alongside me fainted, and they just leave you there till you revived yourself. It run by the Afrikaans teachers, and they were very strict and very, very tough people. One must remember, this is the nation that took on the British Empire during the Boer War and put up a resounding show and kept them at bay for a couple of years.
So very tough living, although it sounds like the caning was almost counterproductive in that it didn't change your behavior at all.
Well, that's right. It made me particularly more rebellious. Maybe it kept others in line, although I don't think so, because we were all as naughty as anything and just rebellious and cause trouble and look for ways to circumvent the teachers, to outsmart the teachers.
So, needless to say, you were quite happy to get out of that high school environment.
Well, it was the unhappiest time of my life. It was a terrible experience, especially I was very close to my parents. We're a small family, just my brother and I and my parents. And but I made some really good friends that I'm still friends with today. And
is that right?
Yeah, we look at our shared experience as an ordeal. But at the same time, those colleagues of mine at school who had to go to the military, it was compulsory in those days, they mentioned that when they went to the military was quite easy for them to adapt to. Whereas those kids at the school who weren't in the hostel, in the boarding establishment, they really struggled in the military.
Yeah, because you had already had experience with kind of a tough life.
That's right.
So then you moved to Durban to attend university?
Yeah, I somehow managed to get a Year 12 pass after struggling at school academically because of my rebellious attitude and because it was a co-ed school, a sort of 50-50, and there's all these beautiful young girls running around, and we were just normal teenagers. I mean, you know, so girls was a big attraction. They kind of added an element of making it worthwhile to be there. And so I never did any work, and I failed twice at school, at high school. The one occasion, the headmaster pushed me through, despite objections from the teachers, because my parents had been to speak to him. And he then called me in and said, "I'm pushing you through. I have faith in you, and I believe you will get your Year 12 and you'll go on to make a success." So,
and you did? Well,
eventually, yes, but it took a long time, and so I had to repeat a year at school, and thereafter I got my Year 12 and my university entrance certificate, and I went back to Durban to attend university.
And then what happened while you were in university?
Yeah, well, university was a wild time because you got to remember that it was the summer of love, Woodstock. Long hair, free love, not that free, but, you know, and drugs and all that, although I never took drugs. And, you know, I drank alcohol in those days at university, and we generally had a wild time. It was really free and wild.
So by contrast to your high school years, now you're really kind of letting your hair down.
Absolutely, letting my hair down literally and figuratively. My hair grew to below my shoulders, and you know, then eventually I finished my degree, and then I decided to.
Oh, and it was in law?
Yeah, it wasn't law, but during that period, one of my friends at university, a guy called Mike, he introduced me to these really cool guys he had met on the beachfront. And he says they called devotees. And he described what they looked like. They had these kind of saffron robes, and they had their hair shaven with a kind of a ponytail thing, and they were beating their drums and singing. And, he'd spoken to them, and he said, yeah, they're called Hare Krishna devotees. And, I thought, okay, well, he says, no, you got to meet them. You got to come meet them. So I went to meet them with him, and eventually we started traveling to the ashram. They sort of a little community of Hare Krishna devotees just out of town. They had a little farm. And there they had built a hall where we'd worship the idols. We'd eat the food offered to the idols. And we'd do singing and dancing called kirtan. We'd bow before the idols, called murtis. And we'd eat the food offered to them called prasad, mahaprasad. Sort of there's supposed to be some spiritual component to doing that, but all the time.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you, before this, you had no interest in religion of any kind. Is that right?
Yes and no. When I was at high school, we were compelled to attend church every morning in town. And I went to the Methodist church, although I'd been raised a Lutheran. But I'd never connected, none of us young guys connected with Christianity at that stage. It didn't seem relevant to us at all. It had no sense of relevance, taking into account the zeitgeist, the spiritual movements at the times, the hippie movement, the investigation of Eastern religions, and that Christianity just didn't connect with the youngsters at that time. Later, we had the emergence of Jews for Jesus and all that kind of stuff. But at the time in South Africa, there was no connection.
But this whole offshoot of Hinduism, that attracted you.
Yes. People were seeking for answers in Eastern religion. I'd been reading a book called Autobiography of a Yogi, and started off at school reading books by a fraud called Lobsang Rampa about Tibetan mysticism. And it turns out later that you find out that he was a retired Scottish teacher living in the Highlands, writing as Lobsang Rampa about the third eye and how you could elevate in these meditation trances. And so at school we were all reading that kind of stuff, but we didn't know.
Oh, but you believed it at the time.
Well, you do believe those things when you're that young and you're searching, you know. And there was books written by a guy called Carlos Castaneda, talking about trances when you partake of Mexican mushrooms, magic mushrooms, and all that kind of stuff. Just unknowingly searching for truth.
So Christianity had no appeal because of the reasons you mentioned, but all this was more appealing to you.
Well, Eric, you've got to take into account this was the time of bands like The Doors, The Who, Bob Dylan, Donovan, Jimi Hendrix, all these great musicians. And you go to a church and there's some 18-year-old old granny, and I love elderly people, so I'm not being disrespectful, playing an organ of tunes written
Wasn't happening for you.
Written by Charles Wesley in the 1700s. I mean,
it wasn't cool.
Definitely not cool, and extremely boring. And we couldn't wait to get out of church. And eventually we started skipping church and hiding somewhere until the church was over, and then making our way back to the boarding establishment. So there was no connection. Music was our thing in those days. Wild living. We'd heard about the hippie movement, all the hits on the radio from the great music of those days. And then you go into a church like that, and how's there supposed to be a connection?
Yeah. And then also you could have your wild living and be religious at the same time.
That is exactly the truth. And when we joined the Hare Krishna movement, which I was in for about 7 years, there were some cardinal rules. One was no meat eating, because that would adversely affect your karma. Then there was no intoxication, no drinking drugs or anything. no illicit sex, and there was no gambling. So those were good things, but they were very tough to follow in the summer of love. So we would get our spiritual input, and then, we'd live our wild life.
Well, that was part one of my conversation with author and columnist Nils Haug. At this point in his story, Nils is living in South Africa and attending university while becoming heavily involved in the Hare Krishna movement. As we just heard, Christianity had no appeal to him. However, we invite you to join us again next time when we'll hear that a drastic change occurs in his life. And it all starts when Nils attends a Bible study with the intention of telling Christians how wrong they are. But something completely unexpected happens. We'll find out about that and more as Nils shares more of his story next time. Until then, I'm Eric Scadabo. So long, and God bless.
You've been listening to Real Faith, and if you have any questions or comments, you can send us a message through our website, realfaith.org.au. That's realfaith.org.au.
Real Faith is a production of Vision Christian Media.
This program is a production of Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, see vision.org.au.